The hook and full story follow below, written straight through without pause. They said it was just snow. They said he was being dramatic. But when the melt came and the truth rose with the water, not one of them could outrun what they had buried. The first time Callum Dreyer found snow piled against his fence, he told himself it was an accident. It was January, and the HOA's contracted plow crew had cleared Pinehurst Circle at 3 in the morning while the neighborhood slept. He'd stood at his kitchen window with a mug of black coffee going cold in his hands, staring at the white mountain pressed along the entire eastern border of his property, a ridge 4 feet high and 20 feet long, and he'd decided, with the particular patience of a man who had survived worse, to let it go. He was new to Pinehurst Circle. He had bought the house in October, just before the leaves finished falling, and he had come in with the deliberate quietness of someone who understood that he was an outsider. The house was a modest colonial on a corner lot. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, and a side yard that dropped slightly toward the street, which he'd already noticed would matter in spring when everything started to drain. He'd grown up in rural Vermont. He understood land and slope and water. He knew that where snow went in winter determined where trouble went in thaw. He was 43 years old, recently divorced, recently transferred by his engineering firm to their regional office in Dunmore, Pennsylvania. He had no interest in conflict. He had no interest in neighbors who watched him through blinds or slipped HOA welcome packets under his door with passive-aggressive underlining. He wanted to cut his grass, maintain his gutters, pay his dues on time, and be left in peace. That was not what Pinehurst Circle wanted from Callum Dreyer. The HOA president was a man named Roland Fitch. He was 57, barrel-chested, with the particular confidence of someone who had once held a title that meant something and never let it go. He had been president of the Pinehurst Circle Homeowners Association for 11 consecutive years. He ran the quarterly meetings from a podium he had personally purchased and engraved, President, Pinehurst HOA, and he spoke at those meetings in a tone that suggested he was doing everyone a favor simply by showing up. His wife, Denise, sat in the front row and nodded at appropriate intervals. Roland's house was directly across the street from Callum's. He had a 3-car garage and a snowblower that he used on his driveway with theatrical precision, making clean passes back and forth while wearing an orange parka that made him look like a traffic cone. Callum had watched him from the window a few times in those early weeks. Roland never acknowledged him. Not a wave, not a nod. Just the snowblower and the orange parka and the clean driveway. The second time the snow appeared against Callum's fence, it was higher, nearly 6 feet. It had happened after a significant storm, 11 inches overnight, and when Callum came outside to shovel his walk, he found the entire HOA plow crew working in tandem, 2 trucks running the circle, and a third machine, a front loader, actively pushing accumulated snow from the center island and the common sidewalk areas directly onto the strip of land between Callum's fence and the road. His land. The 4-foot easement on the corner lot that technically belonged to his property, not the HOA. He walked to the edge of his driveway in his boots and watched the operator of the front loader complete another pass. The man looked at him. Callum raised a hand. The operator turned away and kept working. That evening, Callum sat at his kitchen table with the property survey he'd gotten from the county recorder's office during closing. He spread it flat, weighted the corners with a coffee mug and a stapler, and traced the boundary lines with his finger. The easement was his. The strip was his. He photographed the survey with his phone, then went to his window and photographed the snow pile still glowing white under the streetlight. He sent a polite email to the HOA management company, a firm called Crestline Property Services run by a woman named Greta Hollis, asking for clarification on where the plowing contract specified snow could be deposited. He got a reply 3 days later that said, "In full, the HOA plow crew operates within standard community guidelines. Thank you for your inquiry." He sent a follow-up asking what those guidelines specifically said about private property boundaries. He did not get a reply. In February, it happened 4 more times. Each storm brought another deposit. The pile against Callum's fence grew into a structure, a packed, layered mass that had begun to consolidate under its own weight, fusing into something more like a berm than a drift. It stretched the full length of his side yard facing Juniper Street, and it had started to press against the lower fence boards with enough force that 2 of them had warped slightly outward. He documented everything. He was methodical about it. He photographed the pile from the same angle each time, date-stamped, with a measuring tape extended into the frame. He kept a log in a spreadsheet: date, storm total, estimated volume of snow added to his property, names of crew members he could identify, timestamps from when the trucks arrived and left. He also started to think about the spring. Callum was a civil engineer. He had spent 20 years designing drainage systems, retention basins, and runoff management plans for commercial and residential developments. He understood, with a precision most of his neighbors could not imagine, exactly what 12,000 cubic feet of compacted snow would do to a sloped corner lot when temperatures climbed above freezing. He had already calculated it. The melt volume, the flow rate, the infiltration capacity of the frozen ground beneath. The path of least resistance the water would take once it had nowhere else to go. He knew where it would go. He had known since January. He had not yet decided whether to let it. In the third week of February, he attended his first HOA quarterly meeting. It was held in the community room of the neighborhood clubhouse, a beige rectangle with folding chairs and fluorescent lights, and a coffee urn that smelled like it had not been cleaned since the previous administration. Roland Fitch stood at his engraved podium in a pressed Oxford shirt and read from a prepared agenda with the gravity of a man delivering a State of the Union. Denise sat in the front row. There were 11 other homeowners present, most of them looking at their phones or picking at the cookies on the side table. Callum sat in the back row and waited. When Roland opened the floor for community concerns, Callum raised his hand. Roland looked at him for a moment the way a man looks at something he did not expect to find in his house. "You're the new owner. Corner lot." Callum Dreyer. "Yes. Welcome to Pinehurst." It was said without warmth. "Thank you. I wanted to raise the issue of snow removal, specifically, the practice of depositing plowed snow on my property along the Juniper Street easement." A few heads turned. Roland's expression did not change. "The plow crew clears the community areas. Snow has to go somewhere." "It has to go somewhere on common land or public right-of-way," Callum said, "not on private property. My survey shows the Juniper Street easement belongs to my lot. The city owns that easement. The city has a utility easement through my land. The land itself is mine. Those are different things." He paused. "I can share the survey if that's helpful." Roland looked at him for 3 full seconds. "We'll have Greta look into it." "I reached out to Greta in January. I didn't get a substantive response." "Then reach out again." Roland turned back to his agenda. "Next item." Callum sat quietly through the rest of the meeting. He watched Roland's face when he spoke, the practiced authority of it, the way he handled disagreement by smoothly rerouting around it. He watched Denise nod. He watched the other homeowners not look at him. On his way out, a woman caught up with him in the parking lot. She was perhaps 60, small-framed, with silver-streaked hair pulled back, and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to be useful without being conspicuous. She introduced herself as Vera Okafor, 2 houses down from Callum on Pinehurst Circle. "You should know," she said, pulling her coat tighter, "that the corner lot has had issues with the plow crew for years. The family before you complained. Nothing happened." "What happened to them?" Vera looked at the clubhouse door, then back at Callum. "They moved." He drove home slowly. The snow pile against his fence was lit from below by his exterior light, and it looked, in that angle, like something geological, something that had been there a long time and intended to stay. He sat in his car for a moment before going inside. He thought about the survey. He thought about the drainage calculations he had already run. He thought about the slope of his side yard and the impermeable clay subsoil beneath the frozen ground, and the 6-inch storm drain at the corner of Juniper and Pinehurst that he had already photographed in August, before the leaves dropped and before anyone was looking, because he had been curious about how the corner managed its water, and what he had seen had made him take notes. The drain was undersized. It had been undersized for years, based on the watershed calculations for the expanded community. 32 homes, driveways, rooftops, and landscaping that had all been added in the 20 years since the original infrastructure was designed. On a normal spring, it was borderline. On a spring following an above-average snowpack, especially one concentrated on a sloped corner property positioned directly above the drain. He went inside and opened his laptop. He was not going to move. The storms continued through the last week of February. 2 more significant events, one 8 inches, one 14, brought the pile against Callum's fence to a height he could no longer see over from his side yard. It had become a wall, a white wall, 6 feet high in most places, pressed against the bottom 6 boards of his cedar fence, with enough lateral force that he'd had to add temporary bracing on the inside to keep the fence from failing. He documented the bracing. He photographed the fence boards. He called a contractor friend, a man named Douglas Amari he'd worked with on a commercial project in Scranton, and asked him to come out, look at the fence, and give him a written assessment of the structural pressure and likely repair cost. Douglas came on a Thursday morning, walked the length of the fence with his hands in his pockets, crouched to look at the base, and stood up shaking his head. Whoever is dumping snow here is going to owe you for the fence. 2 boards are already compromised. The footing on the corner post is shifting. Can you put that in writing? Sure, but Callum, that's not the real problem. I know. Douglas turned and looked at the slope of the side yard, then at the street below, then at the storm drain. He was quiet for a moment. When this melts, I know. Douglas looked at him sideways. Do you want it to? Callum didn't answer that. He thanked Douglas and went back inside. He sent another email to Greta Hollis at Crestline Property Services. This one was longer. It included the survey, photographs of the snow pile taken from 17 different dates with measurements, Douglas's preliminary written assessment of the fence damage, and a formal written request that the HOA immediately cease depositing snow on his property and arrange for removal of the existing pile at HOA expense. He CC'd the HOA's listed legal contact, a local firm called Brannigan and Associates, and he sent a copy certified mail to Roland Fitch's address across the street. 3 days later, he received a letter from Brannigan and Associates. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said the HOA was committed to community standards and maintenance. The second said the plow crew operated in accordance with its contracted scope of work. The third said the HOA considered the matter resolved and looked forward to Callum's continued participation in the community. Callum read it twice. He put it in a folder. Then he made a phone call. The person he called was a woman named Simone Beauchamp. She was an attorney who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes, and she had been referred to him by Douglas Amari, who had worked with her on a commercial boundary case 2 years prior. Callum explained the situation in 12 minutes. Simone was quiet through most of it, asking only 3 questions. Was the survey recorded? Had he documented every instance in writing? And had he incurred any measurable damages? The fence, he said. Douglas Amari assessed it at approximately $2,400 in structural damage and likely repair. Good. Anything else? He paused. Potentially, depending on what happens in the spring. What happens in the spring? That depends on whether they stop piling snow there or not. There was a pause on Simone's end. Send me everything you have. Survey, photos, correspondence, the contractor assessment, the HOA's legal response. I'll send a formal cease and desist within the week. Will that stop them? It will put them on notice that they are knowingly continuing an activity that damages private property and creates potential civil liability. What they do after that is their choice. The snow did not stop. On March 2nd, a Wednesday, the plow crew came through at 4 a.m. after a 6-inch overnight storm, and Callum lay in bed listening to the rumble of the front loader working his side yard. He did not get up. He lay still in the dark with his eyes open and listened to the sound of the machine adding more weight to the pile that was already pressing his fence apart. In the morning, he went outside and measured the pile again, 6 feet 8 inches at its highest point. He photographed it. He went back inside and sent the photograph to Simone. Her cease and desist letter arrived at Crestline Property Services and at Brannigan and Associates on March 7th. Callum knew because Simone used certified mail and sent him the confirmation receipts. He also sent a copy to Roland Fitch, certified return receipt requested. Roland signed for it himself. Callum knew because the green card came back with Roland's signature on it, blocky and certain, the signature of a man who did not yet understand that signing for something made it real. 2 days after the cease and desist was delivered, Callum watched from his window as the HOA plow crew came through during a minor flurry, barely 2 inches, and deposited another load on his property. He was already recording on his phone. He got the full sequence. The truck turning, the blade angling, the push, the snow rising against his fence. He uploaded the video to a cloud folder that was automatically time-stamped, then sent it to Simone with a single line. Post cease and desist, March 9th, 6:47 a.m. Simone called him within the hour. They just handed you a much stronger case. I know. Are you ready to file? He looked out the window at the pile. He thought about the slope of the yard. He thought about the soil beneath, frozen solid from 4 months of cold, impermeable as concrete. He thought about the forecast he had checked that morning. First week of April, temperatures climbing, consistent highs above 40, rain events mid-month. Not yet, he said. Callum, there's something I want them to see first. He heard her exhale slowly. What are you planning? Nothing illegal. I just want to make sure the consequences are visible before we start talking about damages. A long pause. I'm your attorney. If something happens that creates liability, I'm a civil engineer, Simone. I understand liability. He paused. I also understand drainage. He could feel her weighing it on her end of the line. Finally, she said, "Keep documenting everything, and call me if anything changes." He said he would. He hung up and went to his garage, where he had spent 3 evenings in the past 2 weeks, quietly assembling something that no one in Pinehurst Circle had noticed, because no one in Pinehurst Circle was paying attention to the right things. March moved slowly at first, the way winter always does when you're waiting for it to end. Reluctant, incremental, teasing. The temperature would climb to 38 for a day, and a thin, dark rim would appear at the base of the snow pile along Callum's fence. And then, overnight, the cold would return and freeze it back solid. And in the morning, the pile would look exactly as it had, immovable and permanent, as if winter had decided to make an example of his property specifically. He did not mind waiting. He had always been better at waiting than people expected. His ex-wife, Judith, had said once that it was the thing about him that scared her most. Not his anger, which was rare and quiet, but his patience, which was consistent and total. "You wait for things like you already know how they're going to end," she'd told him, and he had not disagreed, because she was right, and knowing she was right had not been enough to save the marriage. He went to work each morning. He came home each evening. He shoveled his walk when it snowed. He nodded at Vera Okafor when he saw her checking her mail. He did not approach Roland Fitch. He did not respond to the 2 emails from Greta Hollis at Crestline. One blandly denying any wrongdoing, and one, more pointedly, suggesting that Callum's attitude was creating an unwelcoming atmosphere in the community, because Simone had told him to let her handle all correspondence with the HOA going forward, and he was comfortable with that. What he was not comfortable with was the additional notice that arrived in his mailbox on March 14th. It was from Crestline Property Services on official HOA letterhead, and it informed him that his property had been cited for unsightly accumulation of debris along the Juniper Street easement in violation of Section 4.2b of the Pinehurst Circle Community Standards, and that he had 30 days to remediate the issue or face a fine of $50 per day. The debris they were citing was the snow pile they had put there. Callum sat at his kitchen table and read the notice 3 times. He set it down. He picked it up again. He took a photograph of it. He sent the photograph to Simone with a message. "They are now citing me for the snow they deposited on my property." Simone's response took 4 minutes. "Do not respond. This is actually very helpful. Save the original." He put the notice in his folder, which had grown thick enough now that he had moved it to a 3-ring binder. Survey, photographs, 47 of them spanning 12 weeks, contractor assessment, email correspondence, certified mail receipts, the HOA's legal response, the cease and desist, the video of post-cease and desist plowing, the citation notice. Everything organized chronologically, tabbed, with a summary sheet at the front that he updated every few days. He had also, in the past 2 weeks, had 3 quiet conversations with Vera Okafor, who had turned out to be considerably more useful than he had initially expected. Vera had lived in Pinehurst Circle for 14 years. She had a long memory and the particular clarity of someone who had watched things happen from close range without ever being asked to participate. She told him about the previous corner lot owners, a couple named Briscoe who had argued with Roland for 2 seasons before listing the house in a market where they lost money. She told him about a landscaping dispute 4 years ago in which Roland had used the plow contract as leverage against a homeowner who had voted against re-electing him as president. She told him that Greta Hollis and Roland had been friends for 15 years and that the management contract had never gone out to competitive bid. "Has anyone ever pushed back? Successfully?" Callum asked her. They were standing in her driveway in the cold, keeping the conversation casual for the benefit of anyone watching from across the street. Vera pulled her hat down over her ears. "One man, about 8 years ago. He hired a lawyer and Roland backed down immediately, but the man sold the house anyway, said the atmosphere wasn't worth it." "What was his name?" "Ferris. Martin Ferris." She paused. "You could find him. He might talk to you." Callum nodded slowly. "I might." He found Martin Ferris through a property records search. The man had bought a house 12 miles away in a township outside of Dunmore. He called him on a Sunday. Ferris answered on the 3rd ring, and when Callum explained who he was and where he lived, there was a pause that contained an entire history. "Corner lot on Juniper," Ferris said. "Snow plowing." "Yes." Another pause. "He did the same thing to us, year after year. We asked them to stop. They sent letters. Our lawyer sent a letter. They kept going." His voice was measured, the flatness of something that had been processed but not resolved. "When we finally threatened to sue, Roland had the gall to tell my wife that we clearly weren't Pinehurst people. What does that mean? It means we weren't willing to accept what he decided was acceptable." Ferris was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm still working that out. You're an engineer, you said? Civil, drainage, and site development. A longer pause. Then Ferris said, very carefully, that corner lot floods in a bad spring. I know. It flooded twice while we were there. Came up into the garage. Roland told us it was our problem to manage. What did you do? We sandbagged. Callum looked out his window at the pile. I'm not going to sandbag. Martin Ferris was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone that was not quite approval and not quite warning, good luck. The forecast for the first week of April had been gradually solidifying through the last 2 weeks of March, sustained highs of 44 to 52 degrees, with a significant rain event projected for April 5th through 7th, possibly 2 inches of rainfall over a 36-hour window, falling on ground that was still largely frozen at depth, with a snowpack across the region that had been rated above normal for the 3rd consecutive year. Callum had been monitoring the National Weather Service and 2 independent meteorological services. He had also pulled the USGS stream gauge data for the local watershed and the county stormwater management reports for the Dunmore area going back 10 years. He had done all of this the way he did professional work, methodically, documented, building toward a conclusion that the numbers made inevitable. In the 3rd week of March, he had quietly undertaken a project in his side yard. He worked on it in the evenings after dark and on weekend mornings before the neighborhood stirred. It was not dramatic. It looked, from any angle, like ordinary yard maintenance. The kind of minor grading work any homeowner might do to manage drainage from a problematic corner lot. He moved approximately 4 cubic yards of soil using a rented electric sod cutter and a wheelbarrow. He added a shallow swale, a gentle landscape depression, running from the center of his side yard toward his backyard, where he had excavated a small retention area behind the garage, lined with gravel and filter fabric. He installed a perforated drain pipe at the base of his fence line, running along the full interior length of the snow pile, and connected it to the swale. On the exterior, the side facing Juniper Street, the side with the snow pile, he did nothing. He touched nothing. He did not alter the grade, did not redirect the natural slope, did not add any infrastructure. He simply managed where the water went after it crossed onto his property. The difference was everything. The water that came from his side, from his roof, his driveway, his yard, he captured and redirected beautifully, safely, into his new retention basin, which had adequate volume and infiltration for everything his property would generate. He had engineered it to be slightly oversized, conservative, as good drainage design always was. The water that came from the snow pile on the exterior, 12,000 cubic feet of compacted snow that had been placed there without his consent, without his engineering, and without any drainage infrastructure to manage its melt, would go exactly where the natural grade, the frozen ground, and the physics of water movement dictated it would go. Toward the street, down the slope, toward the undersized storm drain at the corner of Juniper and Pinehurst that was already borderline in a normal spring, and from there, in an above-normal melt event with significant rainfall on top of frozen ground. From there, the water would have to go somewhere. Water always went somewhere. It was the first principle of hydrology. Callum knew where it would go. He had drawn it, to scale, on a site plan he'd made for his own reference. Not for filing, not for show. He kept it in the binder. He looked at it occasionally, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular clarity of someone who has,